They said she was the luckiest woman in the city, married to a billionaire, living behind gates taller than most people's dreams, surrounded by comfort, silence, and luxury. But on one quiet morning, a single ambulance rolled out of that mansion. No sirens, no crowd, no explanations. Inside the master bedroom, she sat alone on the edge of a bed worth more than most homes, staring at her hands as if they were holding a truth she wasn't ready to face. She had wanted a perfect life. She had chosen security over struggle. She believed money could protect her from pain. But that night, something happened inside that house. Something that made her realize that not all prisons have bars and not all wealth brings peace. Her name was Evelyn Moore. To the world, she was lucky. To her friends, she had one life. But behind those gates, behind the smiles, the charity galas, the magazine covers, something was wrong. Why did the billionaire insist on locked rooms at night? Why did the staff whisper but never explain? And why, after 5 years of marriage, did Evelyn still feel like a guest in her own home? Most importantly, what did she discover that made her walk away from everything? Stay with me till the end, because this story is not about love or riches. It's about what happens when comfort hides a truth too dangerous to ignore. Evelyn didn't grow up dreaming of wealth. She grew up dreaming of peace. Her childhood was loud. Arguments through thin walls. A mother who worked too much. A father who disappeared early. By the time she reached her 40s, she wanted only one thing: stability, no more struggle. She had spent 20 years building a modest career as a nurse, watching families torn apart by medical bills, watching marriages crumble under financial pressure. She had dated men who promised love but delivered chaos. Men who borrowed money they never returned. Men whose ambitions exceeded their ability to deliver. She was tired. Tired of counting pennies. Tired of wondering if next month's rent would clear. Tired of living in survival mode while watching others glide through life on cushions of inherited wealth. Then she met Richard Hale at a hospital fundraiser. A self-made billionaire. Quiet. Polite. Older by 15 years. The kind of man who spoke little but watched everything. He didn't chase her with flowers and poetry. He didn't flatter her with empty compliments. Instead, he offered safety. A calm voice in a world of noise. A controlled environment where chaos couldn't reach. A future where money would never again be a worry. Where she could finally exhale without wondering what crisis waited around the corner. When he proposed 6 months later, people said, "This is your reward for surviving life." Her mother cried with relief. Her friends celebrated as if she'd won the lottery. And Evelyn, standing in her small apartment, looking at the diamond ring that cost more than 3 years of her salary, believed them. She believed she had finally escaped the struggle. She believed comfort and security were the same as happiness. The first year felt like a dream wrapped in silk. The mansion had 17 rooms, each decorated by professionals who understood luxury in ways Evelyn never had. There were gardens that required a full-time staff, a kitchen larger than her childhood home, and windows that overlooked a private lake where swans drifted in pairs. Richard was attentive in his own quiet way. He asked about her day. He listened when she spoke about wanting to volunteer at hospitals again. He never raised his voice, never lost his temper, never brought the stress of his business empire into their home. But there were rules. Small ones at first. Dinner at exact times. Always in the formal dining room. Never in the kitchen. Certain rooms she shouldn't enter without asking. Questions about his work that he answered with gentle deflection, as if protecting her from a world too complicated for her to understand. At night, he locked his study. And sometimes, he didn't come to bed until 3 or 4 in the morning. When she asked why, he'd smile that calm smile and say he had business calls with overseas partners, that building an empire required sacrifices she couldn't imagine. Evelyn told herself this is how powerful men live. This is the price of security. She focused on decorating rooms she was allowed to enter, on planning charity events that made her feel useful, on learning the unspoken rules of wealth that nobody teaches you when you're born without it. She learned that rich people speak in implications, not direct statements. That they measure friendship by mutual benefit. That loneliness can exist even in a house full of staff. The staff were kind but distant. They worked in patterns, arriving at specific times, leaving before evening, always professional, always careful never to overstep invisible boundaries. Evelyn tried to befriend them, to have real conversations, but they responded with polite smiles and quick exits. She noticed high turnover. A housekeeper who worked for 3 months and then vanished without explanation. A gardener who suddenly stopped showing up. When she asked Richard about it, he'd say people move on. It's normal in domestic work, nothing to worry about. But something in his tone made her stop asking. Something in the way his eyes went flat when she pressed for details. So she learned to accept the silence. To fill her days with activities that kept her mind occupied. To ignore the growing feeling that she was living in a beautiful museum where she was both guest and exhibit. Before we continue deeper into Evelyn's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The shift began in year 3. Subtle at first, like a photograph slowly developing in a darkroom. Richard started traveling more. Business trips that stretched from days to weeks. When he was home, he seemed distracted, his mind somewhere else even when his body sat across from her at dinner. Evelyn tried to bridge the distance. She planned romantic evenings. She asked if he wanted to travel together, to take a vacation, to remember why they'd gotten married. He'd nod and say soon, once this deal closes, once this quarter ends, once the market stabilizes. Soon became a word that meant never. And Evelyn, sitting in rooms filled with everything money could buy, felt something she hadn't felt since childhood, profound, aching loneliness. She began walking the mansion at night when sleep wouldn't come, trailing her fingers along walls that cost more than most people's annual income, standing in doorways of rooms they never used. And that's when she started noticing things. Small inconsistencies. A door to the east wing that was always locked, even though Richard said it was just storage. Rooms that were cleaned obsessively by staff who arrived at odd hours, always when she was out volunteering or attending charity functions. And the study, that locked study where Richard spent his sleepless nights. She'd stand outside sometimes, listening, trying to understand what kept a man awake when he had everything the world said was worth having. One evening, she heard something that changed everything. It was past midnight. Richard had been in the study for hours. She'd walked down the hallway to get water, trying to be quiet, when she heard a sound from behind the study door. Not voices, not music, not the clicking of a keyboard or shuffling of papers, but crying. Deep, shuddering sobs that sounded like they were being torn from someone's chest. She froze, her hand halfway to the doorknob. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Evelyn backed away slowly, her heart hammering, questions flooding her mind faster than she could process them. Who was crying? Was it Richard? Was someone else in there? Why would a billionaire who had everything sob like a man who'd lost everything? That night, she didn't sleep. She lay in their massive bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Richard finally enter the room around 4 in the morning. He undressed quietly in the dark, slid under the covers without touching her, and within minutes was breathing with the steady rhythm of sleep. But Evelyn stayed awake, watching dawn paint colors across expensive curtains, understanding that something fundamental had shifted. She couldn't unknow what she'd heard, couldn't pretend that wealth and comfort were the same as truth and peace. And the next morning, while Richard was in a meeting with his lawyers, she made a choice that would unravel everything. She decided to look for answers. Evelyn began watching, not spying, she told herself, but paying attention in ways she'd been trained not to. She noticed patterns in the staff's behavior, how they'd glance at each other when certain topics came up, how they'd change the subject if she asked about previous employees, how there was always someone cleaning that locked east wing, but nobody ever went inside when she was present. She started keeping a small notebook, feeling ridiculous but also compelled. Names of staff members, dates they started, dates they disappeared. She found herself Googling their names late at night, finding almost nothing, as if they'd been scrubbed from the internet or never existed in the first place. Richard's business empire, she discovered, was built on real estate development, but not the kind that builds shopping malls and office parks. He specialized in urban renewal projects, buying up struggling neighborhoods, promising revitalization, and then systematically displacing long-term residents to build luxury condos that locals could never afford. She found articles buried in local news archives, protests that never made national headlines, families who'd lost generational homes, community centers demolished, small businesses forced out, all legal, all profitable, all justified with language about progress and economic growth. Richard's name appeared in dozens of articles, always quoted saying the same things about rising property values and inevitable change, as if human displacement was just weather patterns that couldn't be controlled. One afternoon, while Richard was traveling, Evelyn did something she'd never done before. She asked the housekeeper, Maria, to have coffee with her. Really talk, not just exchange pleasantries. Maria hesitated, glancing toward the door as if Richard might materialize even though he was 3 states away. But something in Evelyn's face must have convinced her because she finally sat down, hands wrapped around a mug, and said, "What are you really asking me?" Evelyn didn't know how to answer. She wanted to ask about the crying, about the locked rooms, about why everyone seemed afraid of a man who never raised his voice. Instead, she said, "Do you like working here?" Maria's silence lasted so long that Evelyn thought she wouldn't answer. Then Maria said quietly, "The pay is good. The work is steady. And sometimes that's enough." But she wouldn't meet Evelyn's eyes when she said it. That night, Evelyn lay awake again, thinking about Maria's answer, about how it echoed her own reasons for marrying Richard. The pay is good. The life is steady. Sometimes that's enough. But was it? Could it ever be? She thought about the families displaced by Richard's developments, about whether they'd also told themselves that survival was enough, that fighting for something better was a luxury they couldn't afford. She thought about her younger self, the woman who'd worked double shifts as a nurse, who'd believed that suffering built character, that struggle was noble. What would that woman think of who she'd become? A woman living in luxury built on other people's displacement, telling herself she'd earned this comfort through years of hardship, as if pain could be exchanged for permission to stop caring about anyone else's pain. The locked study became impossible to ignore. Evelyn found herself standing outside it multiple times a day, listening, wondering, her hand hovering over the doorknob, but never quite turning it. Until one night, when Richard was attending a conference in another city, scheduled to be gone for 3 days. She stood outside the study at 2 in the morning, knowing this was her only chance. Knowing that if she opened that door, she couldn't unknow whatever she found inside. Knowing that some truths change everything and there's no going back to comfortable ignorance. She thought about walking away, about going back to bed, about choosing peace over truth. But her hand was already turning the knob, and she realized with sudden clarity that she'd made this choice the moment she heard that crying weeks ago. The study was exactly what she'd expected and nothing like she'd imagined. A massive desk, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, expensive leather chairs, but also filing cabinets, dozens of them, lining one entire wall, and journals, leather-bound journals stacked on the desk, on the chairs, on the floor. Years' worth of journals, each one labeled with dates going back decades. Evelyn picked up the most recent one with shaking hands. The handwriting was Richard's, neat and controlled even on paper. But the words were not controlled at all. They were confessions. Pages and pages of confessions written like letters to people who would never read them. To families displaced by his developments. To small business owners bankrupted by his projects. To communities destroyed in the name of progress and profit. Richard hadn't been hiding money or affairs or illegal activities. He'd been hiding guilt. Massive, crushing guilt that he carried silently while the world praised him as a visionary developer, as a job creator, as a philanthropist who donated to hospitals and schools built on land where other schools and homes used to stand. The journals cataloged every project, every displaced family, every closed business, every promise broken. And in the margins, in smaller handwriting, were notes to himself. Reminders that business requires difficult choices, that progress demands sacrifice, that he'd pulled himself up from poverty, and why should others expect different? But these rational justifications were crossed out, rewritten, crossed out again, as if he couldn't convince himself no matter how many times he tried. Evelyn sat on the floor of that study until dawn, reading journal after journal, watching a man unravel on paper while maintaining perfect control in life. She read about the night he'd bought the land that became their mansion, how it had been a neighborhood of modest homes, a community of families who'd lived there for generations, how he'd offered them money far below market value, knowing they had no leverage to negotiate, knowing that if they refused, he'd find legal ways to force them out anyway. How he justified it by telling himself he was offering them opportunities they'd never have otherwise, even as he watched moving trucks carry away their lives. How he'd broken ground on the mansion and thrown up behind the construction trailer, his body rejecting what his mind insisted was necessary. And then she found the entry about her, about why he'd married her. He'd written it the night he'd proposed, sitting in his car outside her apartment, working up the courage to knock on her door. The entry was titled Redemption or Delusion, and it laid out his reasoning with painful clarity. He'd written that marrying someone good, someone who'd spent her life helping others, might somehow balance the scales of harm he'd caused. That living with a nurse who'd witnessed suffering might make him more human. That if he could make one person happy and secure, maybe it would prove he wasn't entirely the monster his journals suggested he'd become. He'd written, "She deserves better than what I can offer, but I'll try to be better than what I am." And then, in the margin, in smaller writing, "Or maybe I'm just buying forgiveness the same way I've bought everything else." Richard came home 2 days early. Evelyn heard the car in the driveway and knew immediately that he knew. That somehow he'd sensed what she'd discovered. Or maybe he'd installed cameras she'd never noticed. Or maybe guilt just has a way of knowing when it's been exposed. She sat in the living room, journal still in her lap, and waited. When he walked in, he didn't look surprised to see her there. Didn't look angry. He looked relieved, like a man who'd been holding his breath underwater for years and finally found the surface. He sat down across from her, hands folded in his lap, and said, "I wondered when you'd look. I left the study unlocked on purpose. Not consciously, maybe, but some part of me wanted you to know." Evelyn didn't know what to say. All the questions she'd prepared, all the accusations she'd rehearsed, felt suddenly inadequate. This wasn't the conversation she'd imagined. There was no anger, no defensiveness, no attempt to justify or minimize. Just two people sitting in a beautiful room, looking at each other across a distance that wealth had created but couldn't bridge. Finally, she said, "Why did you marry me?" And Richard, who'd spent 5 years answering her questions with careful deflection, told her the truth. "Because I thought loving someone good would make me good. Because I thought your kindness might rub off on me like transferred ink. Because I was tired of being alone with what I'd become, and I thought a witness might make me change. But it doesn't work that way. You can't borrow someone else's humanity. You can't live in their goodness like it's another luxury property you've acquired." He told her about the crying she'd heard. How some nights, the guilt became so overwhelming that he'd sit in that study and weep for hours, surrounded by journals filled with names and faces he couldn't forget. How he'd tried therapy, tried meditation, tried volunteering, tried donating money to the same communities he'd displaced, but nothing touched the core of his shame. How every morning he'd wake up and put on the mask of a successful businessman, speak confidently to investors and politicians, shake hands and make deals, all while carrying this massive weight of harm he could never undo. And how marrying Evelyn had been his last attempt at feeling like a decent person, as if love could be a transaction where he traded security for absolution. Evelyn listened to all of this and felt something unexpected, pity, not for what Richard had done, but for how he'd trapped himself in a life he couldn't escape even as it consumed him from the inside. She understood then that wealth could be a prison in ways poverty never was. That success could lock you into patterns you hated but felt powerless to change. That comfort could become a cage you'd built so carefully that you couldn't find the exit even when you desperately wanted to leave. She thought about her own choices, about how she'd married him knowing she didn't love him, telling herself that security was enough, that she'd earned the right to stop struggling, about how she'd become complicit in his empire the moment she'd accepted the benefits it provided. But she also knew, sitting there in that expensive living room, that staying was impossible. Not because Richard had done terrible things, though he had. Not because he'd married her for the wrong reasons, though he had. But because she'd discovered something about herself in reading those journals. She'd been using Richard's wealth the same way he'd been using her goodness, as a cover story to avoid looking at uncomfortable truths. She'd told herself she deserved rest after years of struggle, but what she'd really been doing was hiding from life in a mansion full of locked doors and unasked questions. And if she stayed now, knowing everything she knew, she wouldn't be a victim of Richard's choices. She'd be an active participant in maintaining a comfortable lie. The divorce was quiet. No lawyers fighting over assets. No public accusations. No media coverage. Richard gave her a settlement that she accepted not because she wanted it, but because refusing it wouldn't change anything he'd already done. She donated most of it to community organizations working in neighborhoods where Richard's developments had displaced families. It didn't fix anything. Money never does when the harm runs deeper than economics. But it felt necessary, like a small payment on an infinite debt she'd incurred by benefiting from other people's losses. She moved into a small apartment, not unlike the one she'd lived in when she met Richard. But this time, the smallness felt different. Not like poverty or lack, but like honesty. Like a space that fit the real dimensions of her life instead of trying to fill rooms built on foundations she couldn't support. Months passed, then a year. Evelyn returned to nursing part-time, working in a community clinic that served exactly the kind of neighborhoods Richard's projects had destroyed. She wasn't trying to make up for what he'd done. She was trying to understand who she'd become during those 5 years of comfortable silence. She was trying to figure out what it meant to live ethically in a world built on inequality, where someone's luxury always seemed to require someone else's displacement. There were no easy answers. She met patients who'd lost their homes to developments like Richard's, who now lived in shelters or overcrowded apartments, who'd been promised progress that looked nothing like what they'd been sold. And she couldn't tell them she understood because she didn't. How could she, having chosen to marry into the very system that had harmed them? One afternoon, she ran into Maria, the housekeeper from the mansion. They were both buying groceries at a small neighborhood market. Maria looked surprised to see her there, carrying a single bag of basics like a regular person instead of having staff deliver everything to a mansion. They talked briefly, awkwardly at first, and then Maria said something that Evelyn would remember for years. She said, "I always wondered if you knew. About the house, about the rooms we cleaned that had been someone else's homes before they were demolished, about why Mr. Hale kept that east wing locked. That's where he stored all the architectural models of his projects, the before and after renderings. He'd walk through there sometimes at night, looking at what he'd destroyed and what he'd built in its place. I think he wanted to remember. Or maybe he wanted to punish himself. I never understood which." Evelyn realized then that everyone in that mansion had been carrying secrets, that the staff had known more than they'd said, that they'd been complicit too, needing the work, the steady income, telling themselves that someone else would do these jobs if they didn't, that they weren't responsible for their employer's choices. That wealth created these complicated webs where everyone was both victim and participant, both harmed and benefiting, both wanting to escape and needing to stay. And she understood that leaving had been necessary but not sufficient. That the real work wasn't walking away from comfort, but figuring out how to live with integrity in a world designed to make that nearly impossible. She heard through mutual acquaintances that Richard had sold most of his properties, that he'd started a foundation focused on affordable housing, though some people said it was just reputation management, and maybe it was. That he'd moved to a smaller home, though smaller for a billionaire still meant something most people would consider a mansion. That he was seeing a therapist regularly and had apparently stopped the kinds of developments that had built his empire. Evelyn didn't know if any of this was real change or just another mask, another way of managing guilt without fundamentally transforming. But she also knew it wasn't her responsibility to judge or monitor his journey. She'd married him thinking she could escape her own life. She'd left him understanding that nobody escapes themselves, that the only choice is whether to look honestly at who you are or spend your life building beautiful rooms to hide in. Years later, someone asked Evelyn if she regretted marrying Richard. She thought about it for a long time before answering. Did she regret choosing security over love? Did she regret 5 years in a mansion while other people lost their homes? Did she regret benefiting from a system she now spent her time trying to counteract? The honest answer was more complicated than regret. She said, "I learned something I needed to learn, but I wish I'd learned it differently. I wish I'd learned it in a way that didn't require me to be complicit in harm." But maybe that's the point. Maybe we're all complicit in ways we don't want to examine too closely. Maybe comfort always costs someone something, and we've just gotten very good at not asking who's paying the bill. The question isn't whether we've made mistakes. The question is what we do after we finally see them clearly. She thought often about that night in Richard's study, reading journals filled with guilt and rationalization, watching a man try to write his way to redemption or at least understanding. She thought about how he'd tried to use their marriage as a kind of penance, as if loving her might somehow balance the scales of all the harm he'd caused. And she understood now that this was its own kind of violence, making her responsible for his moral rehabilitation, expecting her presence to transform him in ways he couldn't or wouldn't do himself. She'd been treated like a talisman, a good luck charm, a symbol of possible redemption rather than a person with her own complicated history and needs. And she'd accepted this role because it came with security, because after years of struggle, the promise of never worrying about money again felt worth almost any price. But the price had been her own integrity. The price had been looking away from questions she should have asked, accepting comfort built on foundations she couldn't support, telling herself that she'd earned the right to stop caring about how wealth gets made. She thought about all the times she'd heard about Richard's developments, about protests and displacement, and chosen not to dig deeper because she didn't want to know. About how she'd lived in that mansion for 5 years, walking past locked rooms and silent staff, telling herself that powerful men have their reasons, that she couldn't change the world anyway, that her own survival and comfort had to come first. And she understood that these were all true statements and also all excuses. That truth and self-justification could exist simultaneously, that people contain contradictions, that nobody is purely victim or villain, but everyone makes choices that place them somewhere on that spectrum. She wondered sometimes if Richard had changed or just changed the optics of his life. If his affordable housing foundation was genuine transformation or sophisticated image management. If he still cried in locked rooms, or if he'd found some new way to manage his guilt. But mostly she stopped wondering about Richard and started wondering about herself. About what it meant to live ethically in a profoundly unethical system. About whether it was possible to accept any comfort when that comfort came at someone else's expense. About how to balance survival needs with moral obligations. About whether people could truly change or just learn to live more comfortably with who they'd always been. These questions had no easy answers, which was exactly why they mattered. The lesson Evelyn carried forward wasn't about wealth or marriage or even about Richard specifically. It was about the cost of comfort. About how security can become its own trap if you let it. About how staying silent in exchange for stability is a trade that seems reasonable until you realize what you've traded away. She'd learned that not every open door leads to freedom, that some beautiful spaces are designed to distract you from noticing you're locked inside. She'd learned that poverty and wealth are both forms of struggle, just different forms, and that escaping one doesn't necessarily mean you've found peace, just different kinds of problems. She'd learned that you can't borrow someone else's goodness, and you can't love someone into becoming who you need them to be, and you can't build a life on foundations you're afraid to examine. Most of all, she'd learned this. A perfect life built on comfort alone will eventually demand your soul as payment. Not all at once, not obviously, but gradually, through small compromises and unasked questions and locked doors you agree not to open. Through days that turn into months that turn into years of telling yourself that this is enough, that you've earned this rest, that you don't have to look too closely at how the machine works as long as it's working in your favor. Until one night you hear crying from behind a locked door, and you have to choose whether to keep walking or stop and listen. And that choice, that single moment of deciding whether to know or not know, defines everything that comes after. So let me ask you, what would you have done in Evelyn's place? If you'd spent years struggling, barely making ends meet, working yourself to exhaustion, and then someone offered you complete security, would you have asked hard questions or accepted the gift? If you discovered that your comfort came at other people's expense, would you walk away or tell yourself that you didn't create the system? You're just surviving inside it? How do any of us live ethically when the world is built on inequality, when someone's gain almost always requires someone else's loss? These aren't abstract questions. They're the questions we all face every day in smaller ways. Every time we buy something made by exploited labor, every time we benefit from systems we didn't create but participate in, every time we choose our own comfort over someone else's justice. And here's the harder question. Do you think people can truly change, or do they just learn to manage their guilt more effectively? Did Richard transform, or did he just find a more palatable way to live with who he'd always been? Did Evelyn leave because she'd grown, or because she'd finally been forced to see what she'd been avoiding? Can any of us really escape ourselves, or do we just move through the world carrying the same patterns, the same fears, the same rationalizations, hoping that new circumstances will somehow make us different people? I don't have answers to these questions, But I think asking them is the beginning of something important, something necessary, something that might look like actual change instead of just more comfortable ways of staying the same. If this story moved you, if it made you uncomfortable, if it made you think about your own choices and compromises and the prices you've paid for security or comfort or peace, then it did what stories are supposed to do. Subscribe for more stories that linger long after they end. Stories that ask hard questions without offering easy answers. Stories about real people facing impossible choices in a world that demands we choose between our survival and our values. Because the truth is, we're all Evelyn in some way. We're all Richard in some way. We're all trying to build lives we can live with while carrying weights we don't know how to put down. And maybe the first step toward change is just admitting that, just seeing it clearly, just stopping long enough to hear the crying behind the locked doors of our own lives and asking ourselves what we're going to do about it.